Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is Madeline from KnittingHouseSquare and today I have a fun fall knitting tutorial for you. So this video that you're currently watching is how to knit a pumpkin flat. And it's actually part of two videos that I'm putting out this week, where there's one that's very beginner friendly, which is the video you're watching, how to knit a pumpkin flat. And then there's another one that I would say is more for intermediate knitters, which is how to knit a cable pumpkin. So they essentially create the exact same product. The cable knit pumpkin ends up being a little bit smaller, so these are knit out of the exact same yarn and has more detailing. The video you're currently watching is for the flat pumpkin. So the way this has worked is you can work it on straight knitting needles, so it's just worked back and forth, not in the round. We knit the pumpkin, then we knit the stem, also worked flat, and then we go through the seaming and the assembly. So on my website, you're going to find the full written version of the pattern. And in the video description down below, you're going to find each one of the video breakpoints. That way you can fast forward or rewind any specific part of the video that you're looking for. Now in this video, it is beginner friendly. So I'm going to take you through everything you need. So I show you how to cast on, how to knit, how to purl, how to increase, how to decrease, how to cast off, how to seam, every single one of those different steps. If you do feel that you're a more experienced knitter, you may want to head over to the cable knit pumpkin video, which is also coming out this week. In this video, it's a bit more advanced. I skip over some of those steps like how to knit and purl and cast on, and I focus more on how to cable in the round. So pick the right video for you, or if you're more of an experienced knitter, you can just check out the pattern on my website. Now, just for inspiration, here's a few of the pumpkins I've knit so far. So this one's one of my favorites, and this is the one you'll see me knit. This one is knit out of Vanna's Choice in the terracotta colorway. I love this one. If you're looking for a miniature pumpkin here, this one, same exact pattern, just knit out of fingering weight yarn, which is sock weight is another name for it. So a little mini version. We also have another larger version here. So this one's also a worsted weight. And one thing I think looks really cute is if you decide you want to, knitting some of the cable knit pumpkins in combination with these pumpkins knit flat. So let me make a little stack here. I think that makes such a cute decoration. So this is a worsted weight video you're currently watching, pumpkin knit flat, followed by a cable knit pumpkin in DK weight, followed by a fingering weight. This might actually be sport weight. Check the video notes on my website. Then up here at the top, we have a fingering weight. So it looks so cute. Here's another example of a huge pumpkin. So again, what we're going to start off with is all the supplies we need to make the pumpkin, and then we'll start knitting. So let's get started. Now to start off, we're going to go through the supplies for the pumpkin. What I have in front of me is first a pair of scissors, a tapestry needle, my yarn. So for my yarn, I'm going to be knitting this out of Vanna's Choice in the terracotta colorway. And this one is one of my favorite pumpkin colored yarns to use. There's actually a whole bunch of different variations of colors that I've used to knit these pumpkins. So another example, this one is Sunset Fiber Co. from Lancaster, PA, and this is her sweet potato pie colorway. So that's another beautiful option. And I definitely showed one pumpkin made out of this yarn in my video intro. Another example would be something like this super mini pumpkin here. This one I knit out of fingering weight yarn or sock weight yarn. So you really can knit this pumpkin out of any weight of yarn you'd like. The weight of yarn is just going to determine how large or small the pumpkin is. So this weight of yarn that I'm using in this video is called a medium or a worsted weight. So on the yarn label, it has a number 4. And then no matter what size yarn you're using, you just want to look at what recommended needle size the tag has. So this yarn recommends a size US 9 knitting needle. So that's what I'm going to be using to knit my pumpkin out of. For something like my fingering weight yarn, right? The fingering weight yarn recommended between a US 1 to a US 2. So I used a US 2 knitting needle to knit this. So use whatever size knitting needle your yarn is recommending. This tutorial is knit flat. So what that means is we're never actually going to work in the round. So for your knitting needle, you have the option to choose between using straight knitting needles or using a circular knitting needle and knitting flat. So my knitting needles that I own are almost all circular in all the sizes. So I'm going to be using a size US 9 circular knitting needle. I'm not actually using the circular capabilities of it. I'll just be knitting flat on this knitting needle. I'll also have on my website listed various yardages that I used depending on the weight of yarn that I knit my pumpkin out of. So you'll be able to see the yardage for the mini size and for the size I'm knitting now. Last up, I have a few stitch markers here. So I have 6 stitch markers total. And you really can use any type of stitch marker. I have some here that are the opening and closing ones. These ones are great, they're from Amazon. Some of these floop stitch markers, which are stretchy and kind of fun. But any stitch markers you have, if you don't have stitch markers, you can also just take a piece of yarn and just tie it in a little knot. So it creates a loop, and you can use those as stitch markers as well. I just recommend using a different color than what you're currently using for your project so they stand out a bit. Now that we have our materials, let's get started. Now first up for the cast on, we're going to cast on 14 stitches, and the cast on method we need to use is called the backward loop cast on. So the backward loop cast on, this one is nice because it's a very simple cast on method, and it does make for an easy edge for us to close up later on. So this is actually, let me find the bottom. This is actually our cast on edge that will make into a really tiny circle at the very end of the project. So I'm gonna leave a little bit of a tail here, probably about 12 inches is my tail. And once I get to that 12-inch point, I'm gonna take my left hand and lay it behind the strand of yarn. Now I'm gonna grab onto that strand of yarn with my bottom 3 fingers, and I'm gonna take that strand of yarn and move it back behind my pointer finger down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom. Now, once I'm back down there at the bottom, I'm gonna grab onto that second strand with my left hand. So it's basically like I have 2 full loops and then kind of like a half loop over here. Now I'm gonna rearrange these loops to make a slip knot. So I'm gonna take the second loop, move it up closer to the top of my finger, take the new second loop, move it up closer to the top of my finger, and now take that newest second loop, slide it off of my finger, and we've made a slip knot. So we want to take this slip knot and take either one of your knitting needles, again, straight or circular, and I want to take my knitting needle and go into this slip knot, going from right towards the left, and when I'm looking at this slip knot, the yarn tail is closest to me. Now I'm going to gently pull on that yarn tail so the stitch tightens onto the knitting needle. Now you don't want to tighten it too much. You want to make sure you can still move it back and forth, but it is snugly on the knitting needle. So that's our first stitch. Now we want to cast on the next 13 stitches to give us a total of 14. So I'm going to grab the yarn tail that I have here, so the piece of yarn that isn't attached to the ball, and just hold that right there in my right hand. And I'm kind of grabbing onto close to the top of that knitting needle with my right hand. How we cast on is I'm gonna have my ball of yarn, I'm gonna put it in front of me further away than the knitting needle, and I'm gonna take my left hand, go behind the strand of yarn, grab it with my bottom 3 fingers, and now for the backward loop cast on, we're gonna take our pointer finger, go down below the strand, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, and now I wanna slide this topmost loop off of my finger and onto the knitting needle. So I'm gonna repeat that again. I'm gonna go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top. Now I'm gonna slide that topmost loop off of my finger and onto the knitting needle. Repeat again. So go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, slide that topmost loop off of my finger onto the knitting needle. Now if you ever accidentally let go of the strand of yarn, that's totally fine. You can reset up. So the way you reset up is, again, you just put your left hand behind the strand of yarn, grab it with your bottom 3 fingers, go down below the bottom, up the front to the top, and wrap it one more time, down below the bottom, up the front to the top. And then start sliding off of your finger and onto the knitting needle. So wait until you have 14 loops on the knitting needle. So right now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I need 5 more. Okay, double count real quick that you do have 14, including that first slip knot. Once you have 14, we're gonna do our first row, which is increase setup row 1. So to work that, I'm gonna turn my work. So now the knitting needle with my stitches on it is pointed over towards the right, and I'm gonna grab onto my other knitting needle in my right hand. So first it says knit 1. So to work a knit stitch, you're gonna go into the base of the first stitch on your knitting needle, going from left over towards the right, and then you're gonna take your yarn that's attached to the ball of yarn, don't accidentally work with your tail, and you're gonna wrap that strand of yarn back behind, then in between the 2 knitting needles, and pull it snug. Then you wanna take that right knitting needle and slide it out, and as you're sliding it out, you wanna pull the loop through that stitch. Slide that stitch off of your left knitting needle. So that was a knit stitch. And now we need to work something called a knit front, knit back. And you'll notice there's little asterisks around the knit front and back, or KFB. What that means is we want to repeat that all the way across the row. So I'm going to continue working this knit front, knit back all the way across until 1 stitch remains. Knit front and back means that first we want to knit into the next stitch as we usually would. So I'm going to go into the base of it, starting at the left, going over towards the right, wrap my yarn up in between the 2 knitting needles, pull it snug, and then as I'm sliding that right knitting needle through, I'm gonna pull the loop through. Now, if I were just knitting this, I would slide this stitch off of my left knitting needle, but I don't wanna slide it off yet. I wanna knit through the back of the same stitch. So I'm gonna tilt my knitting needle so that I can see the back. And now I'm going to take my right knitting needle point and go into the back of the same exact stitch, wrap my yarn over towards the left underneath, then towards the right above, pull it snug, and then as I'm sliding that right knitting needle through, I want to pull that loop out. Now that I've knit through the back, I can slide that stitch off of my left knitting needle. So I just knit into the front, and then the back of the same exact stitch. So I turn 1 stitch into 2 stitches. I'm gonna repeat that again. So I'm gonna go into the front, knit into the front, so going into the base from left to right, wrapping my yarn in between, pulling snug, pull the strand through, and then into the back of the same stitch, going from the right towards the left into the back, wrapping my yarn underneath and above, pull it snug, and then pull that loop through. Now I can slide the stitch off of my left knitting needle. So I knit into the front and the back of the same stitch. Showing it a few more times here in slow motion. So knit into the front, pull it through, then into the back, pull it through, slide the stitch off, into the front, into the back, pull it through, slide it off. I'm going to continue working this knit front, knit back all the way across until I get to that last stitch. So this last stitch, I'm just gonna knit. So only going into the front base from left to right, wrapping my yarn around, pulling through, slide it off. Now, once we finish a row, we want to turn our work. So again, the knitting needle point with the stitches on it is going over towards the right. And now we're going to work increase setup row 2. So for increase setup row 2, it says to purl all the way across. So the way we purl is, again, make sure you aren't working with your yarn tail. Move that off to the side. We're going to go into the base of the first stitch, going from back to front, right to left. Then we wrap our yarn around, so going up over, then down the left side, pull it snug, and then you want to push that loop through the stitch on your knitting needle. Slide the stitch off. So I'll show that a few more times here. We're going to go into the base from right to left, back to front, wrap our yarn up over, then down the left side, and then you want to push that loop through the stitch with your right knitting needle, slide the stitch off. Go into the base, wrap your yarn, push the loop through. Into the base, wrap your yarn, push the loop through. So I'm going to purl all the way across this row. All the way across to that final stitch. Now when we finish the row, oops, drop my knitting needle. When we finish the row, we're gonna flip it again. So now our knitting needle point with our stitches on it is going over towards the right. Increase setup row 3 is actually the exact same thing as we did for row 1. So we're gonna knit the first stitch. So going into the front base, from left over towards the right, wrapping the yarn around in the back, and then pulling that loop through. And because we don't need to knit into the back of the same loop, we're gonna slide off that stitch. And now we start working the knit front, knit back all the way across until one stitch remains. So knit front, knit back, to show it one more time. We go into the front base of the next stitch, wrap the yarn around, pull it through, but don't slide the stitch off yet. Now go into the back of the same stitch, wrap your yarn around, pull it through. Now that we've gone into the back, we can slide that stitch off of the left knitting needle. So we're going to continue working knit front, knit back until one stitch remains. For the final stitch, we're just gonna knit it. Now, before you turn your work to begin the next row, what I would recommend doing now is counting the number of stitches you have and verifying that it's correct. So we should have a total of 50 stitches on our knitting needle at this point. Perfect. So once you've verified that you do 50 stitches, we're gonna turn our work and work that final increase setup row 4. So for this one, again, we're just going to be purling all the way across the row. So to show the purl stitch one more time, we're going into the front base, going from right towards the left, back to front, wrapping our yarn up over, then down the left side, and pushing that loop through, then sliding the stitch off the left knitting needle. Go into the base from back to front, wrap it around, push the loop through. So purl all the way across. Turning our work at the end of each row. So now we have our increase rows that we're gonna be working. And on this first increase row, which is called increase row 5, we're gonna be placing our stitch markers. So the way it works is we're gonna divide our pumpkin into 6 sections. And on the outside of the 6 sections, there's going to be one purl stitch, or sorry, one knit stitch at the beginning and end of the row. So first, I'm gonna knit the first stitch, and then you'll notice that the repeat begins. So we have the little stars in the pattern, and in between the stars, it says knit 1, make 1, knit 5, make 1, knit 1, purl 1, then place a stitch marker. So we're gonna repeat that whole portion in between the stars a total of 6 times across the row. Let me zoom in a bit here. And now first, we have knit 1, then it says make 1. So the way a make 1 works is you wanna stretch out your work. So you wanna pull apart your 2 knitting needles, and you wanna look for that topmost bar that connects the stitch you just worked to the one you're about to work. And we wanna pick up that bar with our left knitting needle. We wanna pick it up with our left knitting needle going from front towards the back. So the way we do that is it's easiest if you slide your stitches up close to the top of your left knitting needle. Now take that left knitting needle, bend it down, and go into that topmost bar going from front to back. So we picked up a new bar, and now I'm gonna knit into the back of that bar. So I wanna take my right knitting needle into the back of that new bar we picked up, wrap the yarn around, and pull through. So we just increased 1 stitch. Now I knit 5. So I'm gonna knit 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And I'm gonna work the make 1 again. So I'm gonna stretch out my work, look for that topmost bar, pick up that bar with my left knitting needle going from front to back, and now knit into the back of that bar. Slide that bar off of my left knitting needle. Now I have knit 1, and then this is the first time we've mixed knit and purls together in a row. So I have a purl 1 now. Whenever you work a purl stitch, your yarn needs to be in the front. So I'm gonna take my yarn in between my 2 knitting needles to the front of my work, and I'm gonna purl the next stitch. So I'm going into the base of it from right to left, wrap my yarn around, and push it through. Now we have to place a stitch marker. Now I'm gonna repeat it all over again. So my next stitch is a knit stitch, and when I knit, my yarn needs to be in the back. So I'm gonna move my yarn back to the back of my work. Only put it in the front when you're purling. So I'm gonna knit 1, then I need to make 1. So I'm gonna stretch out my work, look for the bar, pick it up from front to back, knit into the back. Now I'm gonna knit 5. I'm gonna make 1 again. I'm gonna knit 1, and then I have to purl 1, so I'm gonna bring my yarn to the front, purl the next stitch, place my stitch marker. And again, make sure you're remembering to bring your yarn back again after that purl stitch. So I'm gonna continue repeating that 4 more times across the row. And then after I place my last stitch marker, my final stitch will just be a knit stitch. After I've knit that final stitch, I should have a total of 62 stitches on my knitting needle. And now I'm gonna turn my work to work increase row 6. So increase row 6. Now we're gonna be purling those end stitches. And the repeat is a little bit simpler on all of these backside rows. So we're actually looking at the inside of our pumpkin on all these even rows. So first, I'm gonna purl the first stitch. Then I'm gonna pass the stitch marker. So I'm just gonna move that stitch marker from my left to my right knitting needle. I'm gonna knit 1. So now I'm knitting, so I need to bring my working yarn to the back, knit 1 stitch. Then I need to purl until the next stitch marker. So because I'm purling, I need to bring my working yarn to the front again, and I'm gonna purl all the way up until the next stitch marker. Now I'm going to repeat the portion in stars. So I'm going to pass the stitch marker. I'm going to knit one. So because I'm knitting, my working yarn needs to be in the back. I'm going to knit one stitch. Then I need to purl all the way up until the next stitch marker. So I'm going to bring my working yarn back to the front again in between my 2 knitting needles and purl all the way up until the next stitch marker. And I'm going to continue repeating this all the way across the row. And again, that last stitch across your row, all the way over here on the other side, that will be a purl stitch. Now you'll notice the rest of these increase rows look very familiar to the rows 5 and 6 that we just worked. So for instance, for row 7, we're going to knit the 1 edge stitch, then we're going to work the repeat of knit 1, make 1, knit 7, make 1, knit 1, purl 1. So we switched from 5 stitches in the middle up to 7 stitches in the middle. Then for row 9, we'll have 9 stitches in the middle. Then across each one of the back side rows or wrong side rows, right, we're passing the stitch marker, knitting 1, then purling all the way up until the next stitch marker. So now I'm going to continue working all the way up through increase row 14. Once I complete increase row 14, I'll come back and meet back up with you to discuss how the repeat rows are going to work for the center portion of the pumpkin. Now I've completed all the increase rows, so I just finished increase row 14 and I'm about to start the repeat rows. How the repeat rows work is essentially what we're doing is we're just knitting all the way across until 1 stitch before each stitch marker and purling that stitch. What these rows are doing is essentially they're keeping the exact same number of stitches that we currently have, so we aren't increasing at all. So if we think about this pumpkin that we have here, we just did this increase portion, so we expanded out to the number of stitches that we need. And now we're knitting this center portion, where essentially the number of stitches is staying exactly the same. So these are our repeat rows. And then once we complete the repeat rows, we'll start working the decrease rows. So the repeat rows are broken into an A and a B. For repeat row A, you're looking at the front side of your work. So you're gonna knit the first stitch, then knit all the way up until 1 stitch before your stitch marker, purl that stitch, pass the stitch marker. Then knit all the way up until 1 stitch before your stitch marker, purl it. Right, keep on going all the way across until the end where you're gonna knit that final stitch. Then when you turn your work and you're on repeat row B, what you're doing here is you're purling the first stitch, then you're passing the stitch marker, knitting 1, and then purling all the way up until the next stitch marker. So we're going to continue repeating this repeat row A and B, and again your number of stitches should stay exactly the same. You're going to continue working this 7 times total for the repeat, which means essentially 14 rows. So you want to work row A, then B, right? That would be 1 repeat or 2 rows, 7 repeats total, or 14 total rows. So I'll catch back up with you once I finish these repeat rows to begin working the decreases. Now the last part we're going to be working on this pumpkin are the decrease rows up here at the top. So these work very similarly to the increase rows down at the bottom. Just now as we work instead of working make ones on either side where we're increasing, we're going to be working decreases on either side. As an example, I'm going to work through decrease row 1. So it starts off with knit 1 for the edge stitch, and then the repeat begins. So it says knit 1, then there's a new abbreviation which is slip slip knit, or SSK. What slip slip knit means is that we're going to slip 2 stitches as if to knit them, then knit them together. And what this creates is a left-leaning decrease. So that way all the decreases on this side are going to tilt towards the left for each one of these different repeat sections. To show an example of how it's worked, I'm going to slip the first stitch on my left knitting needle as if I'm knitting it. So what I'm doing is I'm twisting it. Then I'm going to slip the next stitch on my left knitting needle as if I'm knitting it. And now I want to pass them both back over to my left knitting needle. So the way to do this is you take your left knitting needle point, and if you go into the front of both of them at the same time, it's almost like your two knitting needles are making an X, and they both have the stitches going through them. So now you want to wrap your yarn around your back knitting needle and pull that stitch through both, and then slide both those stitches off. So you can kind of see how those two columns of stitches just turned into one. Next up, we're going to knit 11. And now we have a knit two together, or K2T. So what this is now we have a right leaning decrease. So across each one of these repeats, the decrease over here on the left-hand side tilts in towards the right. The way this works is we are going to knit the next two stitches at the same time. So we're going to take our right knitting needle point into the base of the next two stitches, going from the left towards the right, front to back. So it's going through both of them at the same time. Wrap my yarn around and pull that loop through. Slide both of those stitches off of the left knitting needle. So now we turned those two columns of knit stitches into a single stitch. Now at the end, we have knit one and purl one. So I'm bringing my yarn to the front to purl it, bringing it back once I'm done, and passing the stitch marker. Now to show that repeat one more time, I'm gonna knit one, and then I'm gonna work that left leaning decrease, the slip slip knit. So I'm gonna slip my first stitch as if I'm knitting it. I'm gonna slip my second stitch as if I'm knitting it. And now I wanna take this left knitting needle point into the front bottom of both of those stitches. Knit them together through the back. Another option is if you just slip them both, so you already twisted them, is you can pass both of them back over to the left knitting needle, and then you can insert the left knitting needle into the back of them. Then knit it together through the back, slip both of those stitches off. So both of those ways of moving the stitches around will give you the exact same look. I'm going to knit the 11. Now we're going to knit two together, so I'm taking my right knitting needle point into the front base of the next two stitches at the same time, wrapping my yarn behind, pulling it through, slipping both of those stitches off, knit one, yarn to the front, purl one, yarn to the back, and slip the stitch marker. So now that we've seen how those decreases are worked, I'm going to continue working all the way up through decrease row 10. So all of these rows are going to follow that same pattern where you knit one, decrease, knit some stitches in the middle, decrease, knit one, purl one. And then once we finish decrease row 10, we'll catch back up with each other and I'll show you 11, 12, and 13. And then lastly, how we hold our stitches at the end, because there's a few extra steps we want to do before we actually cast off. Now these final few decrease rows, rows 11, 12, and 13, they work a lot of the similar stitches that we've done before, just they're decreasing at a bit faster of a rate, especially row 11. So for row 11, first we're just going to knit the edge stitch. Now for the portion that we're going to repeat across the row, first we have two slip slip knits. So the first two stitches we're going to work a slip slip knit, next two stitches we're going to work a slip slip knit. Then we have a knit two together, so stitches 5 and 6 we're going to knit two together, and then the last two stitches before the stitch marker we're going to work a new stitch called a purl two together. So first, let's work that slip slip knit to start off, followed by another slip slip knit, now a knit two together, and now we have the new stitch, which is our purl two together. To work a purl two together, you want to bring your yarn to the front because you'll be working something similar to a purl stitch. So I brought my yarn in between my two knitting needles to the front. Now I'm gonna go into the next 2 stitches on my left-hand knitting needle purlwise. Wrap my yarn up over, then down below, and now push that loop through the 2 stitches, sliding both of those stitches off of my left knitting needle. And then you can pass the stitch marker. So we just purled 2 stitches together to turn the 2 stitches into just 1 stitch. Showing it one more time, I'm gonna work across the next repeat. So because the next stitch is a knit-wise stitch, I'm gonna bring my working yarn to the back. I'm gonna do my slip, slip, knit. Another slip, slip, knit. Knit 2 together. And then we have the purl 2 together. So I'm gonna bring my working yarn to the front in between my 2 knitting needles. Go into the next 2 stitches purlwise at the same time. Wrap my yarn up over, then down below, and then push the loop through, slide the 2 stitches off, past the stitch marker. So I'm gonna continue doing this all the way across the row. For the final stitch, I am gonna knit that across this decrease row 11. Now I'm gonna turn my work, and for decrease row 12, I'm going to purl 1, pass the first stitch marker, and then work the repeat of knit the first stitch, then purl 3, pass the stitch marker, knit the first stitch, purl 3, all the way across, all the way up until the final stitch, which I'm gonna purl. And turn my work again. Now we are at the final row of the pattern, which is always very exciting. For this row, we're gonna be knitting our edge stitches. So the first and last stitches are both gonna be knit. And then for each one of the 4 stitch repeats, we're gonna work a slip, slip, knit, and then a purl 2 together. So I'm gonna knit 1 for the edge stitch, then slip, slip, knit, then yarn to the front, purl 2 together. And for this row, also take off your stitch markers as you're going across. We don't need those anymore. So I'm gonna remove my stitch marker, then bring my yarn to the back again, slip, slip, knit, yarn to the front, purl 2 together, remove the stitch marker, yarn to the back, all the way across. And knitting that final stitch. Okay, so now we want to cast off, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to cut a yarn tail, and then we're going to thread the yarn tail through the stitches we have. Now, the first thing we need to do is we actually want to start threading at the opposite side of our work. So the easiest way to do this is to slip all your stitches onto your other knitting needle. So if you're using 2 straight knitting needles, what you want to do is you want to slip each one of these stitches from the right knitting needle onto the left knitting needle, going all the way across. So just slip one after another, all the way across. If you're using circular knitting needles, what you could do instead is just hold onto your work and then pull it until all the stitches end up on the opposite knitting needle point. So when you're all done, either slipping your stitches or pulling on your knitting needle, you should be looking at your work where you have the knitting needle point going over towards the right and the working yarn or the yarn attached to the ball of yarn is coming out all the way over here on the left-hand side. Now cut your yarn, and I always like to have extra, so I'm gonna have it's probably about 24 inches or so here. I'm gonna cut my yarn, and I need my tapestry needle. So I'm gonna thread it onto my tapestry needle. And now starting at the first stitch now, right opposite side of where the working yarn is coming out. I'm just gonna thread each one of these stitches onto my tapestry needle with the waste yarn, or the yarn tail, and off of my knitting needle. Now you can pull it through a little ways. Don't actually pull it tight though. So I'm just leaving it so there's plenty of extra yarn there. I'm gonna leave it just like that and take my tapestry needle off of that strand of yarn. So now I've finished knitting the pumpkin. So I'm going to set this and my orange yarn off to the side. And what we're gonna do next is we're gonna knit the stem. Now the stem, again, we're gonna knit flat. So here's an example of a pumpkin, and this is a much heavier weight of yarn than I was originally using. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna cast on a certain number of stitches. We're gonna work row after row for about 1.5 inches, and then we're gonna start increasing outwards. So essentially you end up with almost like a really curly fabric. Then we'll cast off. So the yarn you wanna use for your stem, I would recommend it be an equivalent weight of yarn to whatever you were using for your pumpkin. So for my pumpkin, I use that medium or number 4 or worsted. So for my stem, I'm just using a contrasting color. So here I'm using some brown. Really, you can use any color, anything that matches your color pumpkin that you used. I'm using some brown, and you don't need very much of it. I'm also going to be using the exact same knitting needles that I used for my pumpkin. So first off, I'm gonna cast on 8 stitches, and I'm gonna use the exact same cast on method that I used for the pumpkin. So I start off with that slip knot. I do like to have a bit extra long of a tail because we will be using this tail for something. So let's say I leave probably about 18 inches there. Put my left hand back behind, grab onto it, yarn goes up, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom. Now we're gonna rearrange these 2 loops. So second loop, up closer to the top of your finger. New second loop, up closer to the top of your finger. Then grab onto the newest second loop, slide it off of your finger, and now you have a slip knot. This is like the sped up version of our pumpkin cast on. Now I'm gonna take one of my knitting needle points, insert it into that slip knot, going from the right towards the left, and then gently pull on that yarn tail to tighten it on. So that is our first stitch. Now we want to cast on 7 more to get a total of 8. So I'm going to take my left hand behind the yarn attached to my ball of yarn, grab onto it with my bottom 3 fingers. Now take my pointer finger down below, up the front to the top, back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, slide that topmost loop off of my finger onto the knitting needle. Then repeat again, so go back behind down to the bottom, up the front to the top, slide it off of your finger onto the knitting needle. Right, and keep on working that movement until you have a total of 8 stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, now we're just gonna work something called stockinette. So stockinette pattern is where you knit across the front side of your work. Then when you turn your work, you purl all the way across the back. So I'm gonna continue working, right? Row 1 is knit, row 2 is purl, over and over again until my work measures approximately 1.5 inches. If you are knitting a really tiny pumpkin, so something like fingering weight yarn, you may wanna bring it down to 1 inch or so. But generally speaking, I found that for most pumpkins, the 1.5 inches looks really cute. So I'm gonna work those 2 rows over and over again until my little piece of work measures 1.5 inches. Now I've gone for about 1.5 inches and I just finished going across one of the purl side rows. So now I'm looking at the front side or the knit side of my work. So next up, we're gonna start those increases. And the way the increases are gonna work is we're gonna work a repeat. So the repeat we're gonna do is knit 1, then make 1. And then it repeats again. So knit 1, make 1, knit 1, make 1, knit 1, make 1, all the way across. until there's one stitch remaining. That final stitch, we're just gonna knit. So a quick refresher of how we do the make one. The last time we did this was for the pumpkin at the base when we were increasing. I'm gonna knit the first stitch, then I'm gonna stretch out my work and look for that topmost bar in between the stitch we just worked and the one we're about to work. I'm gonna pick up that bar with my left knitting needle, going from the front to the back, and then I'm gonna knit that bar through the back. So I'm taking my right knitting needle point behind my left knitting needle point into the back of that loop, wrap my yarn around, pull through, and slide off that stitch we just picked up. Then I start again, so I knit one, and then I make one. We are gonna be working a lot of make ones for this stem. So another tip, if you have trouble getting the knitting needle through the back of that stitch, I do especially with this yarn that I picked because it is a little bit like slippery, it's an acrylic yarn, is if you're trying to get your knitting needle behind, another thing you can do is put your right knitting needle in front and then kind of roll it to the back. So now you're in the back of that stitch. So to show that one more time, you go into the front with your right knitting needle where it's a lot more open, and then you roll it to the back. Just make sure it stays on that left knitting needle, and then you can knit it through the back. So again, continue working that knit one, make one. And then knit that final stitch. Now when I turn my work, I'm just gonna purl all the way across this side. So purling every single stitch. We're gonna work that increase row one more time. So we're gonna knit one, then make one, and work that all the way across until the last stitch. So knit one, make one, knit one, make one, all the way across. For the final stitch, just knit that stitch. After that increase round, again, we're gonna turn our work and purl across. Only a few more rows here left before we finish the stem. Now for the last increase row, we're gonna work the exact same thing again. So we have knit one, make one, all the way across, knit the final stitch. And after this, all we have to do is cast off. Now turning my work to the purl side, we're gonna cast off across this purl side row. So the way the cast off is gonna work is we're gonna purl the first stitch, and then we're gonna purl the second stitch. Now you have two stitches over here in your right hand knitting needle, and we wanna cast off one stitch. So we're gonna take our left knitting needle point and pick up the stitch that's closer to your hand. Now take that stitch and slide it over the other stitch. So the other stitch is still on my knitting needle, and slide it off of your knitting needle. So it's kind of like you wrapped the further back stitch up over the other stitch. So we actually just cast off one stitch. Now we want to repeat it again. So we're going to purl one more stitch. So now we have two stitches over here on the right hand knitting needle. I'm going to take my left knitting needle, pick up the stitch that's closer to my hand, and then pull it up over the other stitch. So you can see that other stitch is still on my knitting needle, and off. So now we just wrapped that stitch around the current stitch. Repeat again. So purl one stitch, take the previous stitch, slide it up, over, and off. Purl the next stitch, slide the previous stitch, up, over, and off. And I'm going to continue doing this all the way across the edge. When you get to the end, you're going to end up with just one stitch on your right knitting needle. So what I do here is I pull that so the loop becomes larger. Now I can put my knitting needle to the side, and I'm going to cut my yarn. I do leave probably about 18-inch tail again, That way I have some yarn to seam with. So I'm gonna cut my yarn, and then I take that yarn tail and I thread it through that loop that I just created with the final stitch. I'm gonna pull it right through. Now before I put this to the side, I'm just gonna do a quick little seam here. So I'm gonna take the cast on tail that I started with, thread it onto my tapestry needle. And what I wanna do is I just wanna sew the two sides of starting off with that stem together. So unfold it as much as you can. And then here it definitely doesn't need to be perfect. So just pick up a little bit of each side, each stitch you go across. And then continuing down, seaming across the two edges where we did all those increases as well. And just check every once in a while to make sure that the end is gonna line up. So you wanna make sure all the way around that cast on tail, those two pieces are gonna end up around the same place. Down here at the bottom, I just went all the way along that edge there and seamed all the way down. I'm gonna take off my tapestry needle and just put this stem to the side. Next up, we're gonna seam up the pumpkin. Okay, so seaming the pumpkin, we're gonna be using a technique called mattress stitch. And what you're doing with mattress stitch is you're picking up basically the bar connecting the edge stitch and the next stitch in from either side and going back and forth. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna create almost like an invisible seam. So it blends perfectly into where your pumpkin goes or was knit. So let me see if I can even find the seam on this pumpkin. So this one is where my seam was. So that even just took me a bit of time because looking at this pumpkin from the outside, I can't tell at all where that seam was. So that's our goal. The way we're gonna accomplish this is first, we need a piece of yarn to seam with, a new piece. So I'm gonna take my ball of yarn, any of my yarn left over, and I recommend doing about 3 times the side that we're seaming. So measure out about 3 times that edge, cut your yarn. I always like to have extra, and then thread it onto a tapestry needle. Now you can start at the bottom or the top. It doesn't really matter. Put that off to the side there. I'm gonna start at the bottom or the cast on it. So to show you what bars I'm talking about, first thing I wanna do is I wanna find that edge stitch. So that edge stitch, we always knit. So I have a column of knit stitches going all the way along the side. And then next to it, I have the purl bumps. So if I stretch out my work, I can see that my purl bumps are this one that kind of makes a rainbow shape. And the stitches in between connecting that purl bump to the knit stitches on either side are these U shapes. So from the right side of my work, right, or this right side edge, I want to pick up this leftmost U shape. So all the way along this edge, there'll be a bar that's directly to this knit stitch column. And next to the purl stitches, it should be the lower bar, right? It goes U, then like a rainbow shape, then another U. You want this U shape. On the opposite side, what we want to pick up is we had 2 knit stitches in a row. So I have my edge, you kind of have to unroll it. So that's this stitch right here, all these V's going all the way down. Then next to it, I have another column of knit stitches, so all of these V's. If I pull on my work, I can see that there are bars connecting the column on the side to that first or that next column of knit stitches. So I want to pick up these bars connecting the first knit stitch to the second knit stitch. So they're always kind of hidden. You almost have to put your knitting needle into your work and then pull out, and then you'll see those bars. Okay, so let's give this a try. So I'm gonna start over here on the right-hand side. Find your cast on tail is probably down here if you cast on the same way as me. And then you have your column of knit stitches going up the side. So I'm gonna pick up one of these bars down here at the bottom. I'm gonna put my knitting needle underneath it, and I'm gonna pull it through until there's a bit of a tail remaining here. So I probably still have about 10 inches or so. Now I'm gonna go over to the opposite side. I'm gonna look for the column of knit stitches on the side and then stretch it out so I can figure out where that first column of knit stitches connects to the second knit stitch, stretch it apart, and pick up one of those lower bars. So I usually don't pick the bottom one. You can pick the bottom one if you want to. I always go up to the second one. I'm gonna go underneath that second bar. Make sure you still have that yarn tail down at the bottom. Now I'm gonna go back over here and I'm gonna move up one bar. So I'm gonna pick up the next one just above it, go back over to the other side, move up one bar. Go back over to the other side, move up one. So you essentially just wanna make sure you're picking up all the bars that are all lined up on top of each other. And this technique is called mattress stitch. It really comes in handy. And it's also a really good stitch to use if you're knitting something like clothing where you really want to hide your seams. Over here on the right-hand side, I've now gotten past all of those knit front and back rows. So now I'm in the purl stitch column. And again, I'm just making sure I'm picking up that first or that leftmost U shape. Once you get a little ways, so I usually do this about every inch or so, I'm gonna hold on to the tail at the bottom and I'm gonna pull on the piece of yarn that I've been seaming with. And that's gonna close up that seam. So make sure you hold on to this one at the bottom because you don't want it to pull all the way through. Once you've pulled it tighter, just restart again. So pay attention to which side you just ended off on. So I just did a right side. So now the next bar I'm gonna pick up will be over here on the left. And keep on tightening it about every inch or so, just so you make sure everything looks good and is staying lined up. I'm gonna continue seaming all the way up this edge. Now that we finished seaming, and just to show you real quick what my finished seam looks like, down this column is right where my seam goes, so it stays nice and hidden, and it looks just like all my other columns of purl stitches. Now we're ready for the assembly. So what we want for the assembly is, again, our tapestry needle, and then you're gonna wanna cut 3 strands of yarn. I would recommend the strand of yarn being about 4 times the length of your pumpkin. So I'm just gonna measure 1 out. So it's about 4 back and forth. Cut it, and then measure out 3 more strands that are the same length. Okay, so I'm gonna take one of these strands, put the other 2 to the side, and thread it onto my tapestry needle. And my goal for this next step is I want to thread this strand down one of the columns of purl stitches, starting at the cast off edge. This is where the yarn is just pulled through each one of those stitches. So go all the way down one of the purl columns, then flip it and come all the way up the opposite side of purl stitches. So if you look at the pumpkin kind of from the top, right, I'm gonna go all the way down one side, keep on going all the way across. Then I'm gonna find the purl stitches directly across, start going all the way up this side, all the way back up to the top, right? So we went across 2 columns of purl stitches with my first strand. Then I'm going to do it for my second strand, then for my third strand. And how I want to weave it through, you can start on any one of them. So let's say I start here, is I like to at first just go underneath, then up above, then underneath and up above. And now I like to switch it to where I go 3 underneath. Let me get 3 there. And then 1 above. And then I'm gonna go 3 underneath and then 1 above. Every once in a while you gotta pull your yarn too. So let me pull my yarn through. Make sure you leave a tail up here at the top. Keep on going here. So I'm currently up above. So now I'm gonna go underneath the next 3, pull my yarn through, stay up above the next one, go underneath 3, up above the next one, all the way down this column. And make sure you're doing it on those purl bumps. So the purl bumps like to hide, so it's easier if you stretch out your work as well. Once you get closer to that cast on down at the bottom, we don't actually have the purl bumps anymore. So again, I just go underneath, up above, underneath, up above, anything that I can find down there. Now find the opposite, right? So I just went all the way up here. So now I'm gonna find the opposite one and start doing the exact same thing. So start at the bottom, just go above and below a few times, then start doing 3 below, 1 above, 3 below, 1 above. And your strand should just go perfectly across. Up at the top, again, just like how we started, it won't be perfect, so just go up and down, whatever you have available up there. Okay, so now I have 1 strand going all the way through the pumpkin, and these are my 2 ends from it. So now I'm gonna repeat the exact same thing, right, with my next strand and then my next strand. So I'll catch back up with you once I have all 3 of those strands woven through the pumpkin. When you finish and look at the bottom of your pumpkin, you should have the 3 strands crossing over each other. And then when you look at the top, it'll just be a whole bunch of ends. So first thing we want to do before we stuff the pumpkin is we're actually going to close up this bottom edge. So find your cast on tail. So you have one of these tails that came from seaming, and then one of them came from casting on. So this one is my cast on tail. If you aren't sure, you can just gently pull on one of them, and if it starts closing up the seam even further or trying to, that's your seaming one. It'd be totally fine if you use that by accident. Thread your tapestry needle, and now you want to go around this circle, and you want to pick up the edge stitches as you go around. So as close to the edge as you can get. And I just kind of loop my tapestry needle through them, going all the way around the circle. Once I'm back over to the beginning of the round, I'm going to pull on that to close up that bottom circle. Now you may want to go back up to the top, and those 6 strands that you just seamed with, just gently tug on them to make sure that you can still move them and that they didn't become kind of stuck in that loop we just closed up. So I'm just gonna check for each one of the 3 that they still work. And I can actually check because I see it moving down there at the bottom. Okay, so all 3 of mine still move. We're all set. Now the fun part, we finally get to stuff the pumpkin. So I'm gonna stuff mine using this silky polyfill. I'm pretty sure I got this at Joann's. I just take I just take little grabs of the polyfill and stuff them in individually. And I do tend to overstuff it as well, so I do more than I think I should need. When you think you've stuffed it enough, a way you can test is pick two strings that are part of the same strand, so directly across from each other, and just pull them a little bit tighter, and you'll see your pumpkin start to pucker inwards. So if you like the way that it looks when it does that, you probably have enough stuffing. I'm gonna stop where it is currently, and first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna find my cast off tail. So there's a strand of yarn that we weaved through when we were finishing the pumpkin, each one of these stitches. So unfortunately, this is kind of trial and error until you find the right one. There it is. So when I pull on this one strand, you can see the loop of stitches closes at the top. So that is exactly what I want to see happen. So I'm going to take this strand, once I close it most of the way, thread it on my tapestry needle, pull it a little tighter, and then I'm going to tie a knot. So let me move some of this stuffing out of the way. Just tuck it back in. You can just pick one strand or one loop, one knit stitch around where you just pulled that tight and tie a double knot to secure. And it's okay if it's not perfect or if it opened up a little bit again. The reason it's okay is because we're gonna put the stem right on top of the pumpkin here. Okay, nice and tightened to secure. We're also gonna go down here to the bottom of the pumpkin. It opened up a little bit, so I'm gonna reclose it. And again, I'm gonna tie a knot using my tapestry needle, going under one of the stitches nearby to secure this in place. So get it as tight as you can, and then tie a knot. A double knot, really. I'm gonna tie a knot with that seaming tail that I used as well. Okay, so both of those are nice and secure. Flip it back over to the top side. And now this is the fun part. This is where we shape the pumpkin. So again, you want to find two strands that are on opposite sides, and you can tug on them to make sure they're connected. If they are connected, you should see the one on the opposite side start moving. So what you want to do is first, as if you're tying your shoes or something like that, I'm not good at the names of knots. You want to just tie it one time, and then you want to pull on it. And when you pull on it, you're going to see the shape of the pumpkin start to change. So pull on it to the level where you like the look. And then once it's there, you're going to tie a double knot and try and keep the tension just about the exact same as what you have it. So sometimes it helps if you like over pull it a little bit. That way if you lose any of it, it stays. Okay, those were the first two. I'm gonna move those to the side. Now I'm gonna do the next two. So I find the strand that's on the opposite side. I'm gonna tie them together one time, pull it tight. That looks good. And now do the second knot. Okay, and last up, the third strand. So it's pretty fun how much shape just doing that gives it. Okay, now we're gonna make sure that everything is knotted together nice and secure up here at the top. So I'm just checking all my groups of 2 strands. That looks good. And then I have my cast off tail. I also have my seaming tail left over here. So all I'm gonna do for that seaming tail is real quick, I'm just gonna tie it together with my cast off tail. You can really loop any of these two tails together, tie them as many times as you'd like. Again, this will all get covered up. So the way we hide all of these yarn tails now is I like to take groups of 2 and I cut them so they're a little bit shorter and easier to work with. So I probably have around 8 inches there. They're both the same length, and I'm gonna thread them both through my tapestry needle. Looks good. Now pick somewhere nearby where they are on the pumpkin, thread both of those through to the other side of the pumpkin. Now pull them a little bit tight and then cut those strands. They're gonna disappear into the middle of the pumpkin. Keep on repeating for each set of 2 strands. Once you finish all the strands on the top, flip it over and do the exact same thing, weaving in these 2 strands on the bottom. Now for the stem, we have 2 yarn tails here. So I'm gonna take one of these yarn tails, doesn't matter which one, and I'm gonna thread it onto my tapestry needle. And I'm gonna seam this stem right onto the top of the pumpkin. So you can pick either side, whichever one you'd rather hide. The other one will just end up being the pumpkin, or sorry, the bottom of the pumpkin. So I just pick up, first I'm actually just gonna move the strand in a little bit. So instead of seaming right on the edge, I wanna seam in a bit. So I'm just gonna thread the piece of yarn I'm using over a bit. And now I'm just gonna go back and forth, picking up a little bit of the pumpkin and then picking up a little bit of the stem. And you do wanna try and keep the ruffle of the stem as well. That's kind of what makes it cute. So I always try to move a little bit faster, picking up pieces, or move over further, picking up pieces of the stem. So that way it creates a little ruffle as it goes around. Once you finish going all the way around the stem, finish after just coming out of the pumpkin down here. And then what I do is I just loop back through one of those stitches I previously made and tie a knot. Then I'm gonna weave this end back into the pumpkin the exact same way I did for all those main color pumpkin or those orange ends. Now the last part we have is the stem, and what I want to do here is get it to curve a little bit. So there's 1 yarn tail left, and we're going to use that yarn tail. Thread my tapestry needle with it, and I actually want to start off back up closer to the top of the stem. So I'm just going to thread it underneath and then up pretty far, close, pretty near the top. Now I'm just going to take that yarn tail that's currently coming out, and I just pick a spot that's down here at the bottom, and then you kind of have to angle your knitting needle so it comes out the side. Or sorry, your tapestry needle. I love to do that. And now when you pull that yarn tail, the stem is gonna curve a little bit. So you can play around with how much you want it to turn or what direction you want it to turn. I think that looks pretty cute. So I'm gonna secure that in place. And the way I secure it in place is I just look for one of those spots where I was previously seaming down the stem, and I'm gonna knot the yarn around there. Double tie my knot, and then just thread it through the pumpkin to the other side and cut that strand of yarn. Thank you so much for joining me today as we work through knitting a pumpkin flat. I hope you enjoy, and if you're feeling ready for your next project, be sure to check out my other pumpkin video I put out this week, which is the cable knit pumpkin. This one's knit in the round. Don't forget to subscribe so you stay up to date on all my future videos, and I'll see you next time. Bye.